Okay, final stint. Because of the questions yesterday, I have talked to Bruno and we decided that I'll basically amend the talk a little bit to especially accommodate the questions that you had, because there were quite a few with regards to TMS WEB Core, front end, and that it should look like a web application. So just in case, if you still want the content of the whole application, this is the QR code with the URL where everything is. I'll also update the final server part for you, which is not there yet. But there you can read the whole project, all the sessions from yesterday with reporting, with FNC maps, and the TMS WEB Core. Today we're going to focus on the TMS WEB Core and the XData stuff, and if you want that in detail, that is then explained on that website. Okay. Because the part that I still owe you is when you start the garage sale and want people to sign up, the application, the web application with the sign-up form where people can select the categories. And something like this, you could generate with FNC components, with the barcode components. You could use a JavaScript library if you don't want to use the components from TMS, but you would be able to generate a barcode like this. And what would you encode in such a barcode? Obviously, you would encode the URL, which is inside of this text message. And that's the first step in order to provide a sign-up sheet for a specific yard sale or for a specific customer. You need your web application to start with some knowledge, because the web application needs to know which yard sale, which customer. And the easiest way to do that is parameters inside of the URL. And that's the first thing I would like to present, how you can include a parameter in your application. And also, like this is the application where the parameter right here is 2. And if you remove the parameter, the page shouldn't crash. That's the next thing. It should be, instead you could also show a different page, basically saying invalid URL or something. The other thing is just for proof of concept, if it's another sale, this is what it looks like for a second yard sale. So the whole idea is that this web application gets its input from the parameter right there. Does anybody know what this part of the URL is called? That's the query string, and that's exactly what the property in TMS WEB Core is called, because this is, think of XData, where queries are being specified, and it's really officially called the query string part of your URL. So if we go to Delphi and to the main form, and if we go to query string right here, so I wrote a method which I called initForm. This is where I initialize my form. Of course, I also initialize all the edit controls. We come to those later, but of course we want to make sure that they're all empty when somebody enters our form. And then here is where the magic happens with regards to the parameter. And has query param is a method that is included in the, or a function I should say, that is included in the web.pass unit. So there is no object-oriented approach here. It's just a function in a unit that is provided by TMS. So compared to FNC utils or T advanced utils, you don't have a class with a class method. Instead here, it's a simple function. Has query param, first of all, returns true or false if the parameter that you specify here exists. So it would return false if ID isn't specified. So what I do is I simply set the sale ID to 0. If it does exist, I set the sale ID here. And there's a step in between, as you can see right here. This is the local variable. This is of type string all the time. So that means whenever you request a query parameter, it's always going to be a string, and the var indicates it's being passed in by reference, meaning the function call, even though it is a string, the variable that you pass in will be filled at the same time when you get the return value true or false if it exists. So if it doesn't exist, sale ID in this case will have the same value as before I called the method. So the additional step is here. And just out of curiosity, anybody seeing something new with regards to the first versions of TMS WEB Core in this line of code? I did this intentionally because it's one of the best kept secrets what has been added to TMS WEB Core recently. Pardon?
To integer.
Correct. So instead of having to do string to int, as in the old days, we now have, just like in modern Delphi, we can use types like fSaleID, for example, dot, and we get these things like toString, toBoolean, toHexString, toSingle, toDouble. So it's much easier to read, in my opinion, than, especially when you type. You know, something that happens to me all the time, I type lSaleID, oh darn, I need an integer. So if it's the old function, I would have to go back and would have to type string to int. I also need to remember what is my source type. In this case, I just type dot and then to, and then what I want to have. Integer, string, float, whatever I need. Okay, so this is really, really nice. As far as I know, we also have for date time values, we also have all the new functionality that was rather recently added to Delphi, that you can use any date time value, period. And then you can say increment days, increment months, or just return the year. The only thing you have to do, I think, here, I do it. You have to include date utils. And then I think date time, of course. Let's see, ldate dot. See, you now can basically, this gives you the current time, and this gives you the current time as universal time. So instead having to use encode, decode, you can immediately get all the information. Just get the date part of it, get the time part. Do we have a leap year? You can do this all just using a tDate time value. And of course here you can get the date for yesterday, tomorrow, and here the different parts from the date. So everything that is available in Delphi is also now available in TMS WEB Core. I think it's one of the best enhancements for me as a developer, which is marketing-wise not really effective, you know. But it makes writing code that involves date time values much easier to use. Okay. Good. So that was literally it with regards to the parameter. The trick is that you create a variable in your class that you set using the query string. That's how easy it is that you get your parameter.
But the integer is protected. If the string doesn't contain an integer, will you get an exception?
Correct. I would have to 100% correct. So in order to protect it, you would have to write try except and then catch the E format exception. That's what would happen. Just like, because let's be honest, internally the toInteger call is going to call string to integer. That's exactly what is happening behind the scenes. So the same exceptions are being thrown. Why don't I need, or why did I not implement this here? So this is something where you could basically lead a 2-day discussion with somebody. The reason why I don't do it is your users will never try to figure out these parameters, and the idea is to use a QR code in order to navigate to the page, you know. But to add the exception is no big deal. I agree with you. If that really happens, you redirect them to a different page, to your 404 page or whatever you want to do. Yes, good point. Thank you. Any other comments on that so far? Okay. Now we can come to the more interesting part, something that we've talked about yesterday. So this is the full screen size. And if I now go ahead and minimize the width of the form, you see that it's fully responsive. And at some point, here are the categories on the right. And at some point, they're going to go down like this. And this is exactly what you would see on a mobile phone. That I even prepared a screenshot for that, if I remember correctly, TMS Days. I can't find it that quickly. But like, just believe me, on a mobile phone, you would literally see it like this, okay? So on this, what we've been talking about, like that if you use the components that you drop on the form, the ability you have is using alignments, anchors. That's what you can do for responsive web design. But it's still, I think it was your argument, that it still doesn't look like a web application, then it looks like a desktop application. And this is using everything is using Bootstrap. So that makes sure that the appearance, like these, they even get highlighted, as you can see, because I literally use the most recent version of Bootstrap, and I intentionally even use a version of Bootstrap which is not included in the Bootstrap dialog from TMS WEB Core yet. Why? Obviously, I don't do this to point out that TMS isn't supporting the latest beta, I should say, of Bootstrap yet. I do it to show you that you're not being restricted by anything. You can web design, you can do whatever web design you want with TMS WEB Core. You're not restricted by anything that the IDE provides, for example. So, how did I do this? Hey, obviously it's all in the HTML, sadly. Start like this. And the key part is to host everything inside of a container. So this is the first thing you need to do. I host it inside of a container. That means that Bootstrap automatically puts your page and restricts it and gives it a maximum size so that it doesn't, like my first web designs, they started at the left corner, looked ugly, no frame, no nothing. So this container automatically centers it in the middle, and no matter how big your screen gets at some point, it is always with a maximum width. And the P2 here stands for padding. So Bootstrap has padding classes, and it's really easy. The higher the number, the bigger the padding. And there's 1 to 5. And now people will say, well, what if I want a different padding than the 5 that these people picked? Well, that is in my opinion, the style agreement that you go into. These 5 are the ones that are common in the web community. So if you were to pick a different measurement, your web page would look, from the outside, odd compared to what other web pages look like. So it's always a good thing to use the classes that are included in Bootstrap, P1, P2, P3. And it's the same with margins. You can do margin 2. That means you have margin size of 2. And what you do in order to see how much it is, you just tinker with them a little bit, like try what 1, what 2, what 3, what 4, what 5 is. 5 is quite a lot. It's quite a distance. And the other thing you can do with all these classes, be it P or be it M, you see this all the time on the web in the HTML. PX means that it's only the x-axis, y is only y, and then you have top and bottom. So you have top, bottom, and then you have the others for basically the other 2 sides. Okay, so and P does all 4. So you have a padding of 2 on all sides. That's what I'm doing here. That's the first step. And then I basically start the next group of things with the header, which is separate on top. So if we go over to Chrome here, well, that's the wrong one. If we go over to Chrome, just difficult, right here. So this is why the Visual Studio stuff from Jose is so cool, because you can do the same. You can basically tell the editor, put the what you see is what you get on the left, and you have the HTML on the right. So this is separate. This is a separate card on top. So that is just one group here, and then I start the form, and that's what I want to focus on. So inside of this form, I have one row. Let me enlarge that a little bit. And in this row, I have this construct here. Column large 7. What does that mean? I reserve 7 units of the total width. And the only thing we have to learn as Delphi developers, that in Bootstrap, every line or every row has exactly 12 columns. That's the definition. If you say, well, I need 15 or some other number for columns, well, the possibility is that inside of each column you can have, then again, 12 columns. So the idea is, and it works out. At first I was like, how can I just use 12 columns? How is that supposed to work? It does work, because the whole web, or not the whole web, but most of the web uses Bootstrap. So this means 7 units of those 12 are used for the left side of the form, and the remaining 5, if my math is correct, 5 are being used for the other part, the categories. That's my design. That's what I picked. That's my web design, so to speak. And the LG means that this is only true for large displays. And then you might think, what is a large display? Well, these display classes I actually found, and this is an example where I show you the Bootstrap documentation real quick, where you can find information on this. You go to getbootstrap.com, and then in the documentation you find the breakpoints. That's what it's formally called. And there you see the different breakpoints for the different letters. For example, large means that as soon as it's ridiculous if you think about it, as soon as my design goes below 992 pixels, it's stacking it on top of each other. But after that, it's next to each other. As long as my display has a total width that is wider than 992 pixels, it's next to each other. If it goes smaller, it's on top of each other. That's what you can define with these classes. And for example, if you build a purely mobile application, most likely you will read something like small, because then everything that is bigger than 575 is being stacked. Almost all the time it's being stacked. Okay. So those are the breakpoints, and that is how you get the responsiveness for the different parts of your web design. It has nothing to do with anchors or alignment or the actual content. You simply define this column, you reserve 7 of the 12 for the left part, and the remainder for the, so you're just defining proportions, so to speak. You completely lose any absolute measurements. You just define proportions. So 7 of 12 for the left part and 5 of 12 for the right part. And then I copied this. Again, another example how easy TMS WEB Core can be. If you know where to look, you go here in the layout part, and I scroll down, 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 and there's forms, overview. How to define a form in Bootstrap. And see, this is the example that they give us for an email address, for a password. And I simply copy pasted this. This is literally what I did, because I'm not a web designer. I don't do HTML. I simply did copy paste of that. And that way, see, right here, here it is. I defined all my different fields that I needed in my form. And as the last part, I added an ID field to all the different edit controls so that I'm able to access these things in code. And now the final step, I think Jose explained this, and Bruno also had a session about it. The problem is, how do you tie, basically, how are you able to access these things in Delphi code? And Bruno just explained the element ID. And that is exactly what we need in this case. We need the element ID. Let me just restore my layout here. And tie it right here. Let me make it a little bigger. Here, the element ID points for the name, points to the HTML control. And did I do that myself? No, I didn't. What I did is I simply clicked on the form surface, and then you find one functionality which is called control binding. And what that does, it shows all the controls that are on the form already, and then it shows you which HTML element you have tied it to. Or the other way around, you see the HTML element, and then you see that there is container large not tied to anything. So I have somewhere ID container large in there, and I haven't tied it to any control yet. Okay, so you don't need to. That was also a question from Wolfgang, if I remember correctly. Can you mix these? Yes, you can. You can have controls without and with element IDs and mix them on the form. But still, that is still a lot of work, right? If you have to drop all the controls on the form, all the edit controls on the form, and then assign them, still a lot of work. It's even easier now. You can right-click on the designer and select Control Sync. And what that does, it looks in your HTML document, looks for all the IDs, looks what's on your form, and if the ID doesn't have a corresponding control yet, depending on what HTML tag it is, it will create the controls on the form for you. So in order to create this form, I simply clicked Control Sync, and this was created. This was automatically created by the Delphi IDE. I didn't have to assign anything manually. It all happened automatically. And at that point, you have the form that gives your user the ability to enter the information into your form, and you can access the information inside of your source code. Okay, so implemented at this point is this side here. And for example, if you wanted to read the value of email address, you would then read txt email, because txt email is tied to the element ID txt email. Now the difficult step. I think I have 15 minutes, right? Here, and this was actually the main part initially. I'm asking, what are you selling? These categories right here. And these categories are a list of things that are being retrieved from an XData server, because I have my database with all the categories. can show that right here. So if I go into the database, I have item categories. If I look at the data, this is the table with all the categories in there. And I have on the XData side, I have an endpoint which returns all the categories of that table. So whenever you debug your applications, and that's how I can show you how it is, like, see, press F12 or invoke the developer console on your browser, how it is done for your browser. So here I see exactly what is going on. So this is the first request where we request the page with a parameter. Then Bootstrap is being loaded. Let me make it a little bit bigger. Bootstrap is being loaded. And what you see at some point here, the model, that's already XData. That's what happens if you connect to an XData server. Then the XData control from TMS WEB Core reads the model of your XData server in order to find out what endpoints are available. And then here is this item categories call, and that's exactly what I use in order to get the list of all the categories right here. Do you see, this is exactly the database table, electronics ID 2, toys ID 1, and so on. And how do I get these? Well, first of all, I need to connect to the XData server. Second, I need to basically call the endpoint in order to request the information. And as soon as the information reaches my web application, I need to process this JSON right here and present it right here. Okay? So that's the remaining thing we need to do. And I agree, this is, because there was criticism yesterday, I use the XData components here. Why do I use the XData components? Very, very simple. XData gives me the advantage that I can work with operations and service names. I can specify the name of the service, and I can use basically also add parameters when required. Item categories does not require any parameters. If you use a custom web service, you have to construct the URL yourself. You have to do HTTPS, and this is the server URL, and then you have to. That is what XData does for you. That is why XData reads the model in order to find out what the URL of the endpoint is. For you as a Delphi programmer, it is much, much easier to work with the service that you've defined, and you can use the terminology of the services that you defined. So let me give you a concrete example for that. With regards to connecting to the server, this is the XData connection. And I hard-coded the URL right here to localhost 2011. One question, what is the difficulty with localhost? Because that's the number one question I get when people start using XData. So I host this in a virtual machine. It could also be another computer. And I host this web application on a web server. And it works great when I use it on my development machine. But as soon as I use this very same web application on another computer, hosted, the web application stays hosted on the same web server, but I request the web application from another computer in the network, and what I get is that the XData server cannot be connected to. What is the reason for that? Yes? Port blocked, yeah, that is a good idea, but let me ask you, where is the...
CO.
Pardon?
CO.
Course is also, might be, but Course would have not worked on my developer machine in the first place either. Because it's a web application accessing, it doesn't matter if Course is blocked, it doesn't matter if it's, if it works from there, it should work from another machine on the same network. So
access localhost from a different machine.
we're getting closer. So where is the web application executed in TMS WEB Core? On the web server or on your local machine? In the browser, on your local machine. So if you are on your developer machine and you execute the web application, no matter where it is hosted, and you connect from this web application to localhost, that literally means that this web application tries to find the XData server on that machine where the web application is executed right now. That means it only works if the XData server is on the same machine where the web application is looked at right now. If you go to another machine, localhost is that machine. The XData server is still running on another machine, so it can't find the XData server. So this localhost wouldn't even work if I were to look at this application from my virtual machine, because from here, that wouldn't even work. So if I copy this, and I would have to replace localhost, of course, with the name of this machine, but still it wouldn't work, because if I go into my Mac system, localhost in this case is that Mac system and not the virtual machine. So the XData server there is no XData server on my Mac network, and it wouldn't work. So either immediately use if you just want to use an internal application, if you want to hard code it at first, use the IP address of that computer, because then it works in your network at last. Or use something like domain names that are forwarded with reverse proxies or something. But this is literally the #1 problem of annoyance that I get questions about, like that the XData server can be connected on the developer machine, but it cannot be found as soon as it's on another system. Okay? Good. Okay, localhost. So the port, of course, can also be firewall issues. The 2011, yes. Okay, good. So the connection itself only contains the URL and 2 events I implemented, on connect and on error. Why do I need to do this? Because if you start the connection, and I intentionally said start the connection to an XData server, you don't know how long it's going to take. So that's an asynchronous operation. So you set the connected property to true at runtime, and at some point in the future, either on connect gets called or on error gets called. One of the two. But you cannot expect, if you connect, there's the connect method right here. You see there's only this one line. And if you were to continue coding here, this line is executed immediately after switching the property value, but the server is not connected at that time. Because the server might be fast, yes, but at this point I can guarantee you the server will not be connected. So always just flip the property, and then in the connected event, so meaning we are connected to the server, then start with the operations that you want to do as soon as you are connected. So in this case, request item categories. I want the list of all item categories. If there's an error, there's also something that gets asked quite a lot. As you can see, I host my connection inside of a data module. And my web application here, the form, is right here. So how can this form get any information that the connection succeeded or not? Well, you can provide in your data module your custom events. So what you can do is I define an event F on connection error. So anybody who basically uses this data module can sign up for this event to be informed if there is a connection error, for example. And then you can present the problem on the user interface. Because on the flip side, the data module should not use the user interface either. Data module should never use UI, because you want to pass on your data modules into different projects independent of any user interface. Okay, so let's look at request categories. It's the last step. Is it request item categories right here? And you notice this little custom attribute right here, async. That means that is TMS WEB Core only. I wished Delphi had it, but Delphi doesn't. This is a specific thing for TMS WEB Core. That means in this method, in this request item categories, you can use the keyword which is called await. And await waits when an asynchronous action is called. And I show you an example for that. So here we call, and this is what I mean. We are not using a URL. Instead, I say call from iYardSale service, which is the interface of my XData server, the method item categories. Where do you get this information? What this thing is called? What are your options? You have several. You can open up your server project and simply go into the yard sale service, go up, and then here is the name of the interface, so that is iYardSale service, period. And then you'd simply look up the method that you want to call, which is the item categories right here. Another option is, of course, Swagger. Because if you generate the Swagger documentation, Wagner has talked about it yesterday, I think, not today, it was yesterday, how you can generate Swagger. And one nice thing, I always add to my server template here, you see I have a button here, Swagger UI. And I click on the button, and boom, I have my server API right away for my XData server. So instead of typing it all in, I simply created myself a button in here that I can immediately navigate to the Swagger UI of my service. It's really easy. It's just a shell execute call with open. So as you have the source code, you can look that up. I just wanted to point it out. If you build your own XData server, don't be shy to extend the template for your development purposes, what you need, what you use. I mean, this button literally saves me, I don't know, 20 minutes a day when I look up these things. Okay, so final step, actually getting the data. So here, we need the response that raw invoke returns is of XData client response. There is no other way to learn this other than to look it up in the documentation. This identifies the response of an XData service call. And the second parameter here is, as I said, it's an array of the parameters of your service. So if you look here, I pass in SO usage. If I look at the service here, item categories, I can pass in the sort order. I can sort my categories differently, and I have an enumerable. And enumerables you can, this is a new XData feature, you can pass in an enumerable of the type. I show you the type of that enumerable right here. The T item category sort order, you can either do SO name or SO usage. You pass it in as a string. This is really, really cool. So instead of working with strings, you work with an enumerable, which is type safe. So you can literally say, okay, I want to sort my categories by name or by usage. What does usage mean? Well, it literally goes into the database and counts how many participants picked which category and orders your categories accordingly. So your user interface will not just show the categories here, in the order that they are alphabetically. They're actually in the order how frequently they're being used. So most people are selling electronics right now, then toys, and so on. Okay? And if you could, this is something you can do on your front end, that you offer different parameters to ask different things from the backend. And this cannot be only what you want to retrieve, but also the how, or how you want to filter it. And you could very well add a button here to your user interface and say order alphabetically and order by usage or whatever. And then you have two different calls how you basically sort this list. Okay, final part of that call. So if you get a response, this L response has a status code. HTTP response status codes are defined. It's a list. My book has the most important ones that you need to use. And 200 just means, okay, everything's peachy. And if everything's peachy, we can process the result. And this is, I know it's late, but this is something you will definitely use, and I keep the best for last, right? For you over here, I have the complete exception handling in there, so that you know what to catch, because it's not that easy to find. You need to catch XData client exception. And then you basically are aware that something went wrong on the back end. What went wrong? You can basically evaluate this E. Okay, so assign item categories. That is also something that Bruno implemented a while ago. He wrote the documentation, and I found it by accident how great it was. Because we have this component which is called TWeb Client Dataset. And all I ever used it for in the beginning was I created my field definitions, and I had my datasets in my client applications. And then I parsed my JSON that came back from the XData server manually. I said, like, okay, looking at this concrete example here, I basically, okay, here's an array, so I have multiple records. I read name. I created a new record. I set the name field to electronics and set the ID field to 2, and I wrote it as a loop. You know, but the nice thing is you don't need to do any of that, because this client data set, if you define the fields, that's the key thing. Don't use fetch fields. Go to the fields editor and define fields exactly, meaning mind capitalization. Even though that Delphi is case insensitive, JSON is case sensitive. That means it has to be ID and name. If you don't capitalize ID in this case, it won't work. It has to be exactly as your JSON is, right here. Name and ID. If you have any discrepancies, the field value will be empty because it's matched precisely. And how do we match it? Well, and that is what is so cool, where you can save writing a lot of code. So you have your client data set, you close it, and then you simply assign to the rows property. And what do you assign to it? Well, the array in the JSON object value. That means interpret the result as object value as an array. So let me show you the JSON, then you understand it right away. Look at this. We have a JSON object, right? So we call the method result as object. So at this point we have the whole thing. And then I say value as the property. So at this point, we're here. We have this whole thing. So we would have an object again, but we typecast it to JS array, which is an array, which you see right here. And what is it an array of? It's an array of objects. And this is where TMS WEB Core does the magic for us. Each of these objects is then matched to the fields in your web client data set. So in this case, name will be electronics, ID will be 2, next record, name will be toys. And this is how you can very, very easily read data from a web service. And the best thing is, that doesn't only work for XData. If you have any web service that returns data, for example, in the book I showed with the FinHub web service, you can read it like this quickly without parsing the JSON manually. And then the next question might be, well, the web service might return the data in a form that I don't like. For example, a lot of web services return date time values as Linux epoch time, or epoch time, however you pronounce it. It means like it's an integer with a reference date from 1970. If it's a Linux epoch date, Apple started in 2000. It's in the documentation of your web service, but you don't want to work with that. You want to work with a T-date time value. Another example is if you return UTC, universal time, from your web service, and on your client you want to have local time. So the solution is very, very simple. In addition to the fields that are in here, that are the fields that are inside of the JSON, you can also say add or say new field. And then you, for example, say